Okie dokies. So this is out of Galatians chapter 5. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Father, we do desire the fruit of the Spirit in our lives, and such in a way that it would glorify you. And so we come here that you might help us to be able to not just be in the Spirit, but to walk in the Spirit. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. Well, so last time we were in chapter 20 of Genesis. And we talked about strongholds, at least a little bit at one point. Sins that are, repeated by us despite knowing better. And we read in chapter 20 that Abraham seemed to have a continuous fear that he'd be killed for his wife. He'd be killed by others for his wife. And he couldn't seem to get past that despite his relationship with God and everything else. And you saw that because of this fear, what he really had was a lack of trust in God, that God would protect him. And so that Abraham had surrendered his wife to Abimelech, the king of Gerar. And we read and we talked a lot about the fact that the events show that God doesn't abandon us when we fall short of his plan. When we fall short, when we sin after coming to know him, when we fail, God does not give up on us. God is faithful to us even when we do sin. And we see that consistently throughout the Bible. Now, I told you that as we've been going through these chapters from 12 now and today when we start 21, that we're focusing on Abraham. And not too long from now, the focus will shift to Isaac. Okay? And that's going to be made clearer again to us in this particular chapter. But what have we talked about Abraham as a whole? What are we seeing Abraham do as we go through these chapters? Do you remember?
He's faithful. I mean, he was accounted with righteousness because God gave that to him. But he's a human and he continually makes mistakes, but he's trying.
Yeah, and God credited him with righteousness because he believed God. Remember?
Mm-hmm.
But what's characterized Abraham over these last several chapters?
Well, he was getting better.
Well, he's getting better, but what's the other side of that coin?
He's not perfect.
That's right. He's human. Remember?
Right. That's what I said. He's human. He's like us. He makes mistakes.
Yeah, that's right. And so what we've said is we're watching the sanctification, if you will. We're reading about the sanctification, the process of somebody who goes from a place, starting in non-belief to a place of belief. And I think a lot of times people out there, when they write about the Bible, scholars and such, they tend to talk about Abraham, the faithful man, and the father of the faith, and some of them downplay these places where Abraham has fallen and slipped and not acted faithfully. And others just kind of don't even really talk about it. But I think it's actually a really important thing, because what we're seeing is that he's just like us, and he's growing. Abraham seems to have been alternating between falling short and being obedient. Excuse me. And so, he'll go through an event. We'll read about a story, a part of his life where he's incredibly obedient, like leaving the land of Ur, but he's not fully obedient because he takes his dad with him. And then he stops in Haran. And then he finally comes on down, but then he immediately leaves and goes to Egypt, exits because of a famine instead of trusting in God, and bad things happen. He comes back, he chooses God's way. It just goes on and on and on. And we've seen that. And in this chapter, the reason I bring it up is because in this chapter, we actually see that change. Okay? And I think that's one of the big points of this chapter. Okay? That from here on out, we're not going to see that anymore in Abraham's life. This is the chapter where he starts to display that father of faith, that man who is going to consistently from now on trust in God and follow God with what he calls him to do. All right. So, behind the story as we read it, keep in mind that that's what's going on. Okay. All right. Well, Maya, why don't we get started in chapter 21? Will you read verses 1 through 4 for us?
Yeah, hang on. I'm still in chapter 20 looking at that. You said 1 through 4?
Uh-huh.
Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave him the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him.
That's good. So notice how the chapter begins. How's the chapter start?
That God was gracious.
Yeah, then the Lord, right? And there's a couple of things that are important about that this is the way it starts. This is the way it's introduced. It has to do with the fact that Abraham wasn't particularly faithful to God in the last chapter, was he? And Abimelech near the end, or at one point, points out that, hey, God, not only did Abraham lie to me, but Sarah didn't tell me the truth either. They both are lying to me. Hint, 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 both of your people are liars. And despite that, even though it all turns out fine in the end, Abraham does pray for Abimelech just as God told him to. Notice how 21 starts. In case you had any questions about, well, is God finally had enough? Has God finally seen enough of Abraham's failures, of Abraham's slips, of Abraham's falling short? Well, it starts with God is faithful. Okay, despite Abraham's sins, despite his falling short, God is faithful, and he does visit Sarah. And notice it says that the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. God's promises are good. God is not going to fall back or give up on his promises just because we slip, just because we fail. See, God knows we're human, and he knows that we're not him, that we have failings and we have issues, and he expects and knows that we're going to do these things. Now, it's interesting when you think about it, because I said this, several studies back, that God shows up in chapter 19 and promises Sarah and Abraham that they're going to have a kid, together, and that he's going to come back and visit them in a year, and Sarah will have a child. And when he said that, he knew that the whole thing with Abimelech was going to happen. It didn't catch him by surprise. He knew it. See, he made that promise to them before the whole issue with Abimelech happened, which causes us to have to ask the question, why? I mean, it had to be part of his plan. He knew it, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, he knew that was going to happen, but he also had picked Abraham and had promised him descendants that you couldn't count.
Okay, so why?
Why did he pick Abraham?
Mm-hmm.
Or why did he keep his promise?
All of the above. Why would he, better yet, why would he make a promise to a man that he knows is still going to sin?
Because he knows we're all sinners. It's never going to end.
What else?
Because it's part of his plan. He keeps his word. He said this is what's going to happen.
Because he knows how it's all going to end.
Well, yeah.
He knows where Abraham is going to get to. Okay? And by doing it this order, we get to see God's faithfulness. And we get to see that God really does know what he's doing. Remember, God said, hey, should I share my plans with Abraham? You know, he's going to be a great nation because he's going to teach his children. He's going to pass this on to his children. And indeed, Abraham's going to do that. And as I just said, what we're going to see from here on out is a faithful Abraham. See, God didn't mind doing these things because he knows Abraham is just in the process of growing. He's not done yet, but he's going to get there. And his promises to us are the same way. He knows that today Eric's not perfect. He might be a little bit better than he was 10 years ago, okay? But he's going to get better. So it's the exact same thing with all of us.
So it's sanctification.
Yeah, it's the process of sanctification. And he does it because he knows how it's going to end up, okay? He knows God, he knows that Abraham is going to allow God to work in him and that he's going to take these things seriously, okay? Now, verse 1, all of that's wrapped up in this verse that says, God took note of Sarah as he had said, and he did for Sarah as he had promised. It's such a simple sentence, isn't it? And yet it captures so much, okay? He still does this, by the way, okay? All right? He knows what's going on. He's aware of it, and he's still going to do what he promised. It's that simple, okay? Now, verse 2, it says, Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. And what's interesting about that is, you know, just to try to be funny and poke a little bit of fun, you know, you'd almost think that maybe a woman wrote this part or influenced Moses when he wrote it, because all it talks about is Abraham being old. But how old was Sarah?
She was like in her 80s, 90s, wasn't she?
She's going to be 90. She's only 10 years younger than Abraham. Now in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11, we read, through faith also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed and was delivered of child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. So we've been focusing on Abraham, but every now and again, there's this little hint in here that God focuses on Abraham simply because he's the patriarch, simply because God relates himself to us as male, okay? And so God works and demonstrates that, but it doesn't through the lineage of the patriarchs. It doesn't mean that the women don't matter. It doesn't mean that they're less faithful or anything like that. You see, Sarah had to have huge strength, be able to have a kid and even conceive, we're told, at this age. And she was able to do that because she believed God was faithful too. So we saw that part a couple of chapters ago where she laughed, okay? But Hebrews tells us, hey, look, you know, she changed in the sense that she did believe. Okay, so she conceives and bears a son to Abraham in his old age, in her old age, at the appointed time of when God had spoken. You know, it's important for us to realize here that in just these couple of verses, okay, all we read about, all we know about is Abraham and Sarah's faith, that they believed God. Even though they fell short, they believed God. God does everything else. Even here, she's able to conceive and give and deliver a child when she's well past age because she receives strength from God. You see, a true believer is never limited by their own capabilities. True believers are only limited by God and his plan. God is what matters. Okay? We're not limited by anything other than God. And that's exactly what's happening here. Because Abraham and Sarah, in their own ability, in their own power, you know, at this age, we're told, hey, she's well past age. This isn't going to happen. And we're going to see it more often. But with God, all of these things are possible. It just depends on how it fits into his plan. Okay? And as we go through life, and we see things that are challenging around us, and we say, well, how's this going to work out? And how's this going to... It doesn't matter. Because it's not up to our abilities to fix things or to do things. God takes care of it. We're not limited. So today you may find yourself in a place where you say, well, how is this possibly going to work out? How is this going to be fixed? How am I going to... You're thinking about it from your point of view. God has no limits other than his plan. Okay? And so, you know, there is no limit to believers in terms of what they can do other than what God is willing to do through them. But notice how often our faith is a component to that. Notice also in verse 2 it says that delivered the son to Abraham in an old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. So Sarah has given birth to the long-awaited son, and we're going to see that he's really the son of promise, and that it happens at the appointed time. All right. Now, as I already referred to once before in chapter 18, verse 10, God promised that he would return at this time next year, the appointed time. Okay. And gee, surprise, surprise, it happens right on schedule. That's what this says, at the appointed time. Okay. So it's important to realize that our prayers aren't always answered when we want them to be, or in our desired time frame, or maybe not even in the way that we would like. Okay. But they're done at God's time frame. Okay, so he honored his promise. He came at the exact time. It was the appointed time, the time appointed by God, not the time that Sarah and Abraham wanted it. Okay. The other thing that's so obvious in these first two verses, and we miss so often, is who gave this child to them?
God.
God is the giver of life.
But God gave you and me our children, and
That's
you and
right.
me our children.
That's right, and that's what it's saying right here. God is the giver of life. Okay. Verse 3. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Why does it say whom Sarah bore to him?
I guess because he had another
Yeah,
kid.
and make sure that you know that God's talking about Isaac, and to remind you Oh yeah, in his failings, he had Ishmael through Hagar, but that's not the son that is the important one. Okay, now it's been 25 years since God initially promised Abraham a son and an heir. Okay, and that was in Genesis 12, verse 4. So 25 years, that's a long time to wait for a promise. Okay, I mean, that's a really long time. All right. Have you ever waited 25 years for a promise? I don't know. It seems that way at times, doesn't it? But this is one of those themes that we see in the Bible is 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 believers learning to wait on God and for his perfect time. It's a specific theme in Genesis, but it's a theme all throughout the Bible. Okay, for example, think of King David. King David gets anointed as the next king of Israel when he's probably on the order of about 16. But he's going to run from Saul for 10 years, more or less, okay, before he finally becomes a king of Judah. Okay, and then it's another 7 years before he becomes the king of all of Israel. Okay, think of how long Israel had been promised their Messiah and how long they had to wait for Jesus. And then they didn't even recognize him when he came. Okay, if we think about God's timing, we have to remember the 400 years that Israel is in slavery in Egypt, or the 400 years of silence between the last prophet of the Old Testament, Malachi, and the arrival of John the Baptist on the scene. That's 400 years where God doesn't even speak to them. And we think a lot about how many times God has spoken to or promised or done something with Abraham, something like that, but it's over 25 years. It's not like it's happening every 2 months. If you go through periods in your life where you wonder, hey, how come I'm not hearing from God? It's because that's the way God works. And so another one of those questions we should be asking ourselves is, why would God let us go that long between speaking to us or something like that?
He's testing our faith.
He's growing our faith. Yeah. Right? And that's partly what's happened. He's promised Abraham multiple times, and yet Abraham, has a child through Hagar. Even right after God has made another promise to him, then he offers up Sarah to make sure that he thinks that he'll be safe without trusting God, knowing that God had just said, hey, Sarah is going to be the wife of this child that you so desperately want. And so, God is really growing Abraham's faith. And while he speaks to us in his Bible, and the more we're in his Bible, the more often God will speak to us. It's not quite the same thing as seeing God speak to us through our lives. So, all of this time when God wasn't directly speaking to Abraham and involving himself in their life, did God know what was going on?
Sure.
Well, he knows he knows what's going on in your life too. Just because you don't hear from him doesn't mean he's not right there. And these are important things to think about and to really dwell on, to remind yourself of it, because we all go through periods like Abraham, just as we've been talking about, where we might slip or we can fall short or we don't trust God or whatever it happens to be. Okay? But it's important to remind ourselves that all through the Bible there are instances where God honestly says, hey, this is what happened. And I wasn't always, talking to them, but I was always there. That I'm faithful to my promises and I will do just as I said. So when God promised, hey, that he will not leave us partly finished, that he will complete the job he started in us, referring to the process of sanctification. He's not going to stop. When he promised us a home with him, when he promised us these things would work out, when he promised us the fruit of the Spirit, if you faithfully follow him and focus on him and you're a believer, these things are going to happen. Which leads us to ask the question, well, why haven't they already happened? Why is it that I go through periods where I get upset or worried or this, that, the next thing? Well, hold that thought. We'll come to it.
God's not done with us.
We'll come to it. Verse 3, Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him when Sarah bore to him Isaac. Okay? So Abraham names his son Isaac, which means laughter. Which, it's really kind of interesting you think about it. Can you imagine Isaac now, years later, wandering through the land and some stranger comes across his property, says, oh, hi, hey, look, I'm just trying to find, whatever. Can you point me in the right direction? And would you mind if I, filled up my water bags and with water from your well? And Isaac says, oh, no, go ahead, help yourself. And he says, and the visitor says, hey, my name is so-and-so. And Isaac says, yeah, my name is Laughter. It's just interesting. All right. So anyhow, Abraham names his son Isaac. Verse 4, then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God commanded him. Now, I think this is, we've seen these kinds of things before. So it takes a little bit of hindsight. You got to get to the end of the chapter and you got to get to the next chapter and stuff like that before you really start to realize it. But this is a hint that Abraham has really changed, not because he's faithful one time, because he's been faithful in the past. But notice how this all starts. God is faithful to them just as he promised. Sarah conceives and delivers the child just as God promised. Now Abraham follows that with being faithful, and he names his son Laughter, kind of a funny name, a reminder, if you will, because God told him that's what the name should be, okay? And it circumcises him exactly as God had told him to be. And it's in chapter 17 where God tells him these things. He tells Abraham that the son's name is going to be Isaac, that he's to name him Isaac. That's in Genesis chapter 17, verse 19. And he tells him to circumcise him in 17 and 12, that everybody in the household is going to be circumcised, and you should do it on the 8th day. Okay? So how do you think Abraham feels now that Isaac is born?
I guess very happy.
Yeah, I mean, overjoyed, I would think, right? In fact, I've actually, on some occasions, wondered, how did they feel when they finally realized that Sarah's pregnant as she starts to grow, just like you were talking a minute ago about Megan, your daughter-in-law. I mean, how do you think they felt as they saw her getting bigger and bigger and bigger?
I would have thought they would be like, holy crap.
Yeah, no doubt, right? And when that child is born, do you think they were busy?
What do you mean busy?
Don't you think there's a lot of things to do?
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, they're not going off to the hospital. This is something that's happening in their tent. Now, I'm guessing because they've got, like literally an army of people who work for them and stuff like that they've had many born into their little family. I mean, God alludes to that when he says, hey, get all the men in your camp circumcised. That there's probably midwives, or what we would call today midwives, there to help out. But this is probably a really busy period, and a period where they're overjoyed. and they're excited and their emotions are running wild and all of that kind of stuff. And that's why I point out, and Abraham was faithful. He did exactly what he was told to do, despite all the things going on, despite the relief, despite the joy, despite being worried about his 90-year-old wife giving birth and her health and the birth of Isaac and all. I mean, by the way, what would the doctors tell you today if a 90-year-old woman conceived?
A miracle?
No, they tell you that the baby is going to be born with defects, that this is going to be a problem, that it's going to kill the wife, you need to abort the baby because for the health of the wife, blah, 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 blah. Yeah, by the way, God says they're both faithful. So, I mean, they're both healthy. So in all of this that's going on, Abraham doesn't neglect his part of the deal. Now, the reason I find this important is because, when I get busy during the day, when stuff's going on, or, whatever it happens to be, good or bad, just busy, frustrating, whatever it is, I can easily neglect and forget my promises and my obligations to God. Even though he always straightens it out, even though he always forgives me, even though he's always faithful, it's so easy for me to forget. And so I find it really impressive that at this point in time, and for all I know, they got visitors coming from all around the land wanting to see this 100-year-old guy had a kid. I don't know. For all I know, they're entertaining people. He's going to throw a big party in a couple. I think it's a couple years later, but he doesn't neglect his part of the bargain. And so, I think it's a big deal. And don't forget, what did circumcision mean? What was it? Why was it given to Abraham?
Cutting the flesh.
A show, a sign of faith that they believed in God.
Well, okay, yeah, certainly when he circumcised, he's demonstrating his faith. But what did circumcision? Yeah, and you're right. It demonstrates cutting away of the flesh. We're going to come back to that quite a bit, actually. But what did God say specifically that circumcision meant? It was an outward sign of the covenant that God had made with Abraham. Remember? And so this isn't just being faithful, okay? It means Abraham remembers the covenant. And wouldn't that, I mean, isn't that something that you would do? I mean, here, 25 years later, this son is finally born. And isn't that one of the things that would come to your mind if you're Abraham? Hey, God wasn't joking about this covenant. And so even though I'm 100 years old, even though my wife is 90 years old, even though this is incredibly unlikely, and here's the son, can't I now believe the other things? That there's going to be an entire number of them, that there's going to be more than the stars of the sky, that they are going to go down to Egypt for 400 years, but God is going to bring them back. And out of one of them is going to become eventually the Messiah. Now, he doesn't know him as the Messiah. He just knows the whole world is going to be blessed through his descendants. And Abraham's smart enough to figure this out. Don't forget, when we talked about this, it seems like forever ago, when we looked at those lifespans, when Abraham was born, Noah was still alive. Abraham heard all of those stories. And he didn't hear them from people who were, generations and generations and generations removed. I've been thinking a lot lately about that. We read about Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago. How many generations has there been between us and him? There's nobody alive today who saw Jesus or whose grandfather saw Jesus. But that's not true of Abraham. See, Abraham was, when he was born, one of his ancestors survived the flood. And Shem, I think it's Shem, Ham, whatever. Shem, sorry. He's alive for, he might even live longer than Abraham does. I'd have to go back and check the charts. Okay. I don't know that these people didn't hear about them or hear directly from them or maybe even visited occasionally, although I doubt it. But who knows? Okay? But the point is Abraham remembers all this stuff. Okay? All right, Marie, why don't you read 5 through 8, please?
Let's see, now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me. She also said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? For I had borne him a son in his old age. So the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the same day that Isaac was weaned.
Okay. So verse 5, Isaac is born to a 100-year-old man, and as I said, a 90-year-old woman. And while that's enough of a miracle, okay, and it's clearly there to tell us, okay, that only God could do this, okay, don't miss, again, this same point. And we've seen this several times already in Genesis. God brings life out of death. Okay, it's one of God's specialties. Okay, and he does it over and over and over and over again. Okay, do not think that the only miracle here is that Abraham and Sarah are old. Yes, they're old, but what else has Sarah been all along up until now?
Unable to get pregnant.
Barren. Barren. They've been married for years. Okay, why didn't they have kids before? Because she was barren. So there's actually multiple miracles here. Life out of dead, and we read elsewhere that Abraham's body was as good as dead. Okay. And he's faithful to his promises. Okay, and that God brings life out of death. Okay. It's just one of those things that God does. Remember, we saw that, we talked about that in terms of actually creation. God bringing life out of something that was void, empty, useless, and dead. We saw that after the flood. God again brought life out of the world when it had been so far, corrupted. Okay.
Okay, but I have a question, because after Sarah passes away, doesn't Abraham have like a bunch more kids and everything? So
Yes.
then, how is his body dead, or how is it dead, or
It's God again.
Okay.
It's God.
So those are all miracles too.
These are blessings that God chooses to give to Abraham.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, and when we will talk about that. That's a good point. All right. So he's 100 years old, and I'm going to tell you then. This is my suspicion. Okay, and it's in part due to the way that these chapters lay out. But you can believe it or not, or you can think about it, meditate it on your own. You should. I suspect that Abraham and Sarah have Isaac now only after Abraham has truly learned to trust God and not take things into his own hand. Okay? And we're going to come back to that. Okay, but you got to think about why now. Okay, sure, God is one, but I think we're going to see in the rest of this chapter and in the chapters that follow that the reason God did it is because Abraham is now finally at a point where he really truly trusts and believes in God.
Well, do you mean by that, though, then, that he is never going to sin again? How is that possible?
No, but I think he's going to fall short, okay? But he's never going to do it intentionally, like by giving Sarah away, by taking matters into his own hands, by sleeping with Hagar. He is literally going to leave it to God and trust in him. Okay? I personally believe that is one of the biggest messages in this chapter. Okay? And that leads us to a question. Okay? And this is really a challenging question. And I got to tell you, I'll bet all kinds of pastors and long-term pastors and scholars and everything would come right down on me hard as a ton of bricks. But does God sometimes wait on us before fulfilling promises?
Well, I wouldn't consider it waiting because he knows when we're going to do it.
Okay, but then why doesn't he do it sooner?
Because it's not his plan.
Because we're not ready. That's my contention. And if I'm right, then the next logical question is, what is God waiting to do in your life because you're not ready yet for it?
Well, and that's the thing, we can see it in our own lives, is that, I don't know why God didn't give me, XYZ then, but I can see that, now that I got it, I understand that I wasn't mature enough to handle it then.
I wasn't ready enough. I wasn't faithful enough. I didn't trust him.
Yeah,
all of those kinds of things. That's what I'm saying. I think it's an interesting thing. It's not just simply God and he dreams up, this is when I want this to happen. It's dependent on us, which leads to something really interesting, a conclusion. God times these things based on our best interest. And it's really important to see that. See, it's not that God just wanted, hey, that's great. God gets to show that he's in charge, that he's giver of life, he can do remarkable things, but in part it's because Abraham wasn't ready. And it wasn't the right time for them. Now let's go on. So verse 6, Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. By the way, in the Hebrew, this is basically Isaac's name. His name is probably more likely he laughs rather than just laughter. Okay, just because it's Shiach is his name, I believe it is, and Yishak is here. So there's just a little bit, but it's basically the same word. That's really what it's saying. Is God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh, there it is again, with me. Who's Sarah giving the credit to?
God.
You think she would have done that earlier, like when she's laughing, that God says, hey, Sarah's going to have a kid?
No, probably not.
Maybe not. I don't know for sure. Okay? But I wonder about that, right? I think they're both hilariously happy. And that's what it sounds like here. Okay? God has made laughter for me, and everyone who hears will laugh with me. That's really interesting. If you go to Luke chapter 1, verse 40, don't go there now, but verse 47 and 48, Mary says almost the exact same thing. And Mary said, my soul doth magnify the Lord, and my spirit hath rejoiced in God my Savior. See, both women gave full credit to God for their miracles, their miracle births. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne to him a son in his old age. And that's what I said. There's Sarah again. She's saying in his old age. She's a little bit up there herself. It's interesting, okay, that they're clearly giving all the credit to God. And I'm, like I say, I'm not 100% sure that earlier in the story we would have seen that. Verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. Now, the Hebrew isn't quite that clear, not everybody believes that this great feast was really given on the day Isaac was weaned. It seems to make sense to me since that's what the context of that verse is. Okay, and anybody have a feel for when children were weaned back in that day and age?
I don't know, but the way I look at it is the reason, only because he's happy, but I would think back in those days, babies didn't survive much, so maybe by the time they're weaned, they breathe a sigh of relief. We made it this far, the kid's going to live.
I think there's something like that there. Yeah.
3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. I've seen all kinds of different ages tied to it, but 3 seems to come up most commonly, and I doubt it was anything before that. And so the idea here is the Lord, ensured that Isaac has grown, that he's gotten to the point, Maya, as you say, where he's weaned and he's healthy, he's fully eating on his own, and Abraham, gives a great feast on that day. You think Abraham is still glad and happy and joyous about this son?
Absolutely.
3 years later?
Yeah, therefore the feast.
Yeah. Do we continue to celebrate? Do we continue to celebrate what God has done for us 3 and 4 and 5 years later?
No, I guess we sort of stopped.
Abraham did.
Some things.
Some things. Some things.
The way we should know.
Yeah, and that's the point. Do we celebrate in these things? How about I don't know how far we're going to get. How about Marie read 9 through? Oh no, it's Maya. It's your turn. How about 9 through 12?
Okay. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, "Do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned."
Okay. Now, there's actually some really deep background here that's important to see, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, helps us to understand it. He takes these verses and he applies them directly to Christians and to the church, and you'll find it in Galatians chapter 4, and I'm going to give you a sampling of some of the verses here, okay? But he takes this experience here with Abraham, Hagar, who had Ishmael, and Sarah, who has Isaac, and he relates it to some very important things. So in Galatians 4, chapter 23, for example, Paul wrote, "But the son by the bondwoman was born according to the flesh, and the son by the free woman through the promise." Who's the bondwoman?
Hagar.
Hagar. Who's the son of the bondwoman, born of the flesh?
Ishmael.
What does that mean?
He was born in sin.
What it means is Sarah and Abraham took matters into their own hands, put together their own plan, and it ended up resulting in Hagar giving birth to this son of flesh, Ishmael. And the son of the free woman, who's the free woman? Sarah. And the son of the free woman? Isaac, through the promise. And so Paul is pointing out, don't miss this contrast. We have a complete contrast. When Abraham and Sarah took things into their own hands, they have a son who's born of the flesh. And when they trusted in God, they got a son of promise. Now, in verse 29 of Galatians 4, he writes, "But as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit. Then he goes on to say, so it is now also. That's interesting. Verse 31 of Galatians 4. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but we are of the free woman. See, Paul is directly relating this experience to the church, to today. And he's saying, we are children of the promise. What's the promise?
Jesus.
The promise that Jesus brings. The promise of eternal life. The promise of redemption. And if you think about it, in part what Paul is saying is, hey, this is a remarkable birth, just like Isaac's birth, the birth of the promised son. In Galatians chapter 5, and some of this bleeds into chapter 5, in verse 17, Paul wrote, for the desire of the flesh is against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. For these are in opposition to one another, in order to keep you from doing whatever you want. Why? Hang on a second. Why does Sarah see the son of Hagar mocking and making fun of Isaac?
Well, he's a problem. I mean, it's
He's a problem.
consequences for.
It's his nature. We're told he's a wild man. His hand's going to be against every man, right? What else? The flesh wars against the Spirit. It goes beyond all of these things. Okay? Now, Ishmael is roughly 15 years old at this time. Go back to Genesis 16, 3, and you'll find out why I say that. Because Abraham is 85 when he's born. Notice that his name is not used here. Okay? He's referred to what? The son of the Egyptian. Okay, we're not going to see Ishmael's name used in the context of Sarah and Abraham again. Okay, he'll be the son of the flesh, the son of the bondwoman, the son of the Egyptian. What does Egyptian refer to?
The flesh.
The flesh. What else? The
The
world, the sinful worldly ways. Okay, so he's the son of the sinful worldly way. Okay, he's 15 years older, and he's 15 years older. So by now he's probably 18, because Isaac's probably on the order of 3. You know, there's something wrong with an 18-year-old kid mocking and making fun of a 3-year-old. Now, some people believe when we talk about the 400 years of affliction, where where the Jews, where Israel is in slavery and being afflicted by Egypt, some believe that 400 years started right here on this moment. Here's the son of the woman of Egypt mocking, abusing, and afflicting the son of promise, the son of the nation of Israel. Okay, it's an interesting thought. But I think that there's an important point here, besides the fact that it's his nature and all of these things, despite the fact that, yeah, they got different mothers and all these kinds of things. Don't miss the point. A child of promise is always going to be mocked by a child of the flesh. Children of promise will always be persecuted by the children of the flesh. It goes beyond just different mothers, different backgrounds. There's a spiritual thing here in play. Okay? Now, Sarah witnessed it, and we see that. It's not like they assumed it. It's not like she said, hey, I don't trust this kid. Something like this is going to happen. She actually sees it and witnesses it. And it's very interesting to reflect back on the fact that Ishmael is mocking Isaac here. He's abusing Isaac in some verbal, probably way. Maybe it's more than that. Okay? Don't forget, how did Hagar treat Sarah when Hagar conceived?
She was a jerk.
She was a jerk, so she mocked Sarah too. Now we know the old saying is like father, like son, but here it's really Ishmael is behaving just like his mother. You see, there's things that are inherited. A disbelief towards God, which is really sad because after Sarah gets angry because Hagar is being rude to her, she's acting like she's Abraham's wife because now she's conceived and Sarah hasn't, even though she's the slave, blah, 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 blah. All of these kinds of things. What did Sarah insist on?
She's got to go.
She's got to go. She's got to go. And remember, God found her in the desert and said to her, hey, I know you're pregnant. You're going to have a son. I'm going to make a great nation out of him. He's going to be a donkey of a wild man. His hand's going to be against everybody, but return. Okay? Now, God's not going to tell her to return this time. But the point is, she's already had an experience with God. Didn't she give God a name?
The God who sees me.
The God who sees me. Okay, and we're going to see that while God saw her, she probably didn't really see God. Okay, and that's why this is happening. Okay, she hasn't made a transition. She hasn't believed, and I believe my contention is before this chapter is over, he's going to give her yet another chance, and she's not going to take it. Verse 10, therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. Again, Paul in chapter 4 of Galatians, verse 30, writes, cast out the bondwoman and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be an heir with the son of the free woman. See, Sarah here is not saying, hey, this woman is just being rude to me. This woman's son is picking on my son. She's actually reflecting God's prophecy. Isaac is the son of promise. And she's pointing out that the son of the flesh is not going to be a co-heir with the son of promise. Non-believers are not going to share in the promises of the believers. Period. Without a doubt, absolutely, period. Doesn't mean they can't convert and become believers. As it turns out, there's a lot of evidence to say Ishmael doesn't and his mother doesn't. Okay? Doesn't mean that there won't be a single descendant out of Ishmael's family tree that doesn't become a believer.
Don't you find that extraordinary, though, that God talked to her, and yet she doesn't believe in him?
I hear you. What does that say about her?
I don't know. I mean,
it says a lot, right?
I'm just astonished, and like how could and she sees an old decrepit woman have a baby. How does she not realize it's something? And God talked to her, and then this happens. How does she not see the two? Like, holy crap!
Yeah, I get it. I understand. Okay, I'm telling you, the Genesis. Remember how we started this? We said Genesis would reveal the nature of man and would reveal the nature of God. We've already seen God's faithfulness in this.
Then why this leads me to why am I so blessed? Why am I a believer?
Because you chose to. You have free will. Now, this is what part of that, you know, where is the line between God's sovereignty over these things, okay, versus our free will? And I don't know. The Bible teaches both that believers are foreordained to be believers, but we have free will. So I don't know I don't know how that line works. I do not understand it. There's all kinds of things about God I do not understand.
I don't understand that either, because then it was like God already knows you're going to be born. He knows if you're ordained, going to be a believer or non-believer. So why would He have you born to then rot in hell?
Because He gives you a chance, and because it displays Him. I mean that His love is so great. He's going to give you chance after chance after chance, and we're going to see that here. Not only did she see God or talk to God in the desert, okay, she's going to do it again, okay, but in the intervening 18 years, where has she been living?
In a godly home.
In a godly home, surrounded by godly people. Yes, they slip, but she probably overheard, oh yeah, God visited us today, him and two of his angels, and they came and he promised us this and we promised that. And she probably overheard Abraham's running around like a nut. He's got Sarah making cakes and he's splitting animals in half, and he claims that God's made a covenant with him. She heard all these things. I don't know, she might have even seen some of it. Notice that there's a consistency here in these events, which is what I think in part is what Paul is talking about. Notice that Abraham circumcises Isaac, or cuts away the flesh, representing not just Abraham's covenant with God, but a cutting away of fleshly desires. And then immediately afterwards, Ishmael, who's equated with the flesh, is driven away. I think this is key. And notice what it says, that the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. In other words, now some people have interpreted this to say that the son that he's referring to is Isaac, that Abraham was greatly disturbed that his son Ishmael would make fun of his son Isaac. That could be true too.
But I think it was disturbed that she wants him to get his other son out.
Yeah, and there's ample evidence to believe that as well. I suspect it's both things. But notice that he does it. That he's at a point of faithfulness now, that he's willing to drive the son of flesh away. Okay? I think there's a lot here to be said. Isaac is born to them. They rejoice. They give credit to God. They circumcise him and cut away the flesh in faith. And then immediately afterwards, they send away not just Isaac, but Hagar.
Ishmael.
Oh, sorry, Ishmael. Thank you. Not just Ishmael, but Hagar, his mother. See, Abraham is demonstrating his willingness to cut away the flesh in his life. Why was Isaac born right here, right now? Because Abraham, in my opinion, is finally willing to do this. This is why I said earlier, what is God waiting on us to be ready to do? Are we ready to cut off the flesh? Are we ready to drive away fleshly desires and the fleshly controls in our lives? Are we ready to walk away from those? And if we did, when we got there, would God give us promises that are unbelievable? See, up till now, we've seen an Abraham who, quite frankly, is waffling. He goes from faithful to lack of faithful to faithlessness. Okay? But here, he's going to demonstrate he's willing to send away the son of flesh. And in just a chapter, he's going to demonstrate that when God tells him to, he's even willing to sacrifice the son of promise. Okay? Abraham has become truly trusting in God. Okay? And I think that that's partly what this all represents. Abraham has finally grown in faith and in his willingness to submit to God. Okay? It's a true story of how we have to cut away the flesh in order to get to that place of faithfulness. Okay? And what did they get? They got their promises, they got their desires. They didn't get them when they wanted them. They got them when they were willing to get rid of the flesh. Okay? Now, here's the proof of it. We're going to read next time that after he sends Hagar and Ishmael away, Hagar and Ishmael return to Egypt, and she gets a son for Ishmael from Egypt. Okay? You know what I think? I think she never let go of the things of Egypt. I think she never let go of the false gods, the false beliefs, the false religions. Okay, even though, like we just got done talking about the fact that she had talked to God, that she's living in this godly home, and she's not getting influenced. And at the same time, I think she's a spiritual boat anchor to Abraham. She's dragging him back. She's holding him back. And that's what the world does in the life of a believer. It holds us back. This is why Jesus said, be in the world, not of the world. Don't let it hold you back. That's what we saw in Lot when he was sitting in the gates of Sodom. This is why his daughters ended up being the way they were. They were influenced, they were held back in their ability to faithfully trust and follow God because of the world. This is why it's such a powerful symbolism. It's an allegory, okay? That what we're seeing is Abraham is finally at this point. He says, I'm getting rid of every bit of influence of the world in my life.
Just think how strong his faith was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Sacrifice his own, to sacrifice Isaac.
Yeah, because this is a natural reaction, okay? That this is his son. Even if it's not through Sarah, Ishmael is still his son. So it's natural, okay? By the way, when Paul writes of this, what he's really getting at is that the Jews, the seed of Abraham, who are not born again, like Ishmael, can't accept the child of promise, and they're cast away. If you ever wondered, well, but they are the Jews. I mean, God's going to do something for them, even if they don't believe in Jesus as Messiah. Boy, as hard as it is to hear and as hard as it is to believe, here it is. Children of the flesh who aren't born again and accept the child of promise are cast away.
Doesn't he give the Jews a final chance during
the nation? The nation, yes.
Okay.
I'm talking about individuals, absolutely.
Okay.
Just like God was able to bring life out of dead Sarah and Abraham, which results in the nation of Israel, he's going to bring a live, believing Israel, nation of Israel, who believes in Jesus as Messiah, out of a dead nation. God's specialty is bringing life out of dead. Just when you think it could never happen, he's going to do it. He waits till the odds are so unbelievable that it's clear that only he could do it, And I think he also waits until the person is really ready to cut away the flesh. Doesn't mean Abraham's going to be perfect, but we're not going to read about him making mistakes again.
But don't you think it also alludes to, and I mean, when Jesus says to his disciples, I believe, that, it's going to turn family, I'm going to rip families apart. Others are going to hate their sons are going to hate their mother, daughters are going to hate this. I mean, it's because.
But that's not a statement around permanency. It can be, but it does mean that in a family, and of course Jesus in context was specifically referring to the Jewish family, okay, that was so close to each other and believed in the law and believed in the Torah and all that kind of stuff, that when one in the family became a believer in a new covenant, in freedom from the law, and in Jesus was the coming Messiah, that person was going to be rejected by the rest of the family. Now, that doesn't mean that the rest of the family wasn't going to someday come be believers. Now, some of them wouldn't. So yes, the permanent divisions, but at least the divisions were going to be temporary. In this particular case, I mean, all the indications are is that this is a permanent thing. And remember, as I said earlier a couple of times in Genesis chapter 16, verse 12, recall that God's prophecy of Ishmael is he's a wild donkey of a man. His hand would be against everyone. God doesn't want Isaac growing up with that influence. God is making sure that Isaac doesn't turn into another Lot. See, God will give you all the choices in your life that you want. You get to make the choices. But there are times when God is behind the scenes doing things to make sure you can't make the wrong choice. Okay? God is in control. Okay? And by the way, we'll pick this up next week when we talk about it. This is why Ishmael has to leave. Because correction isn't going to be sufficient. Abraham couldn't go to Ishmael and say, "Don't mock Isaac." It wouldn't have worked. And God knew it, and God said, "Get him out of there." Okay? Any questions? Any comments?
No, it's always a lot to take in.
There's a lot here.
It makes me feel bad because, I don't know.
Well, I understand that there's a lot of conviction here, and there should be, because if God's going to show the nature of man, and He's going to show the nature of God in this book, actually in the whole Bible, but we're just in Genesis, okay, then conviction has to be a normal part of it, because we clearly.
I guess it's a good thing if I wasn't convicted.
That's right.
You know.
But what we also see is God's faithfulness and God's promises, okay, and because we're able to look at this and read this and study this from the hindsight of having the New Testament also. And Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, we know that what God has done is He's brought new life into us because we're born again and we're children of the promise. So it should also make you glad that however this miracle happened in you, it happened in you. And it should make us, just like Abraham prays for others a couple of times already, should make us want to pray for others, that they would have the same experience, that many would come to know Him. Any other thoughts? Okay, I know we went a ways, but we'll pick up kind of here. We'll back up a little bit, just for a refresher, and that's where we'll pick it up next time. Okay, we probably won't finish the chapter next time. We might only go a little ways and finish up. I don't know. I'll have to see how this works, because there's actually kind of three stories here. There's the story of Isaac's birth. There's the story of Ishmael and Hagar being sent away, cutting away of the flesh. And then there's the story of Abraham and Abimelech once again interacting. And we may not do both of those together because they're fairly lengthy. We'll see. Who wants to pray to close this out?
I'll
I
pray.
can.
Oh.
Oh, so go ahead, Marie.
No, you go ahead.
Dear God, I sometimes feel that I am like a broken record. That I say thank you all the time, but is thank you really enough? Please help me and all of us who struggle every day to keep you near and dear. To when the busy day and the frustrations or the exhaustion or just the nastiness wants to bubble up, to push that down and instead remind me that you keep your promises, that you keep your word, and that I am your child, and that I should have no fear. Please, God, help me relay this to others as you choose to use me. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks.